I'm Cynthia Francis Gensheimer, and today is January 29th, 2024. I'm here in Doris's condo in Cherry Creek, and I'll start, Doris, by asking you, what was your maiden name?
Kornfeld, K-O-R-N-F-E-L-D.
And the names of your parents?
J. Kornfeld, Lillian Greenberg Kornfeld.
Great. And where did you grow up, Doris?
I grew up in Wichita, Kansas. I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we moved to Wichita when I was 2 years old. My dad worked for an oil company, and when oil was discovered in the state of Kansas, we all moved there. And so that's how I happened to grow up there.
And was there a Jewish community in Wichita?
Very small, very, very small. And my grandmother moved with us because she was a new widow. And she was crying all the way because she didn't feel that she would ever know that many Jewish people again in Wichita, nor would my mother and dad, and she was right. Tulsa was a much larger Jewish community. But you know, Wichita was very good to my parents. My dad was successful. He became an independent oil producer in a few years after our move. And life was good in that respect. And but I did say to my mother, why do we live here? Why do we live here? And she said, well, you live where your husband makes a living. And that's a true story.
So did you belong to a congregation there?
Oh, absolutely. My parents were very traditionally religious. They both came from Orthodox background. So we belonged to the synagogue in Wichita. And actually, they were the only two people in the synagogue that were American born. They were both my dad was born in Ely, Minnesota, and my mother in Aurora, Missouri. But they enjoyed the congregation, but my mother and dad had many friends. Also at Temple, there were just the two congregations, and everybody was friendly with everybody because there was at most 400 Jewish families.
Oh, were your parents involved in the Jewish, in the temple at all in any official capacity?
Were they involved? Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
With your congregation, were your parents leaders of the congregation?
Oh, absolutely. My dad was a vice president. My mother didn't want him to be a president. That would have been a disaster. My mother was she always was cooking for the sisterhood. They were very involved Jewishly, very, very much so. And we had a very traditional Jewish upbringing. My mother made the holidays really beautiful. She went all out because we did live in such a non-Jewish environment, and she wanted us to love Judaism the way she did, and she really did make every holiday gorgeous. It was really a special treat.
So did you go to Sunday school?
Of course. That was I learned absolutely nothing there because they were very poorly qualified, the teachers. But, you know, it was what it was. I learned everything in college. You know that when I went to Goucher, it was required that everybody had to take a course in the Old Testament. And so I learned all the things that I should have learned in Sunday school then, although I got the feeling of Judaism. And my mother actually, to digress, actually she was a Sunday school teacher. I was the third born, so not in my time, but when my sister and brother were going. So she did know quite a lot, but the teachers I had were not qualified at all. In fact, it was a joke. What I didn't know was a joke. So
I want to get back to Goucher in a minute, but let's just finish up your childhood. So were you confirmed?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And were there any social clubs for Jewish children in Wichita?
I'm trying to think. I think there was, you know, they didn't have a National Council of Jewish Women there, but they had Hadassah as a matter of fact, this is after my sister was the president of Hadassah. I'm getting ahead of the story. You wanted to know about my childhood. I was confirmed, and I think I belonged to the Young Judea. I think that was a young people's group that Hadassah had started. But it made no. It wasn't anything that was memorable. I mean, it was just something that they expected me to do.
Were there any sororities at your high school?
Not Jewish.
So were you
isolated?
Were you a member of a sorority, a non-Jewish sorority?
No. My parents really, really, you know, it's very difficult to raise children in an environment like that. And my parents were really vehement on the fact they wanted their children to marry Jewish, and they feared all those kinds of things. They felt like I wanted to my dad was a terrific dancer, and so was my sister, who was 8 years older, and we all danced and we all learned all that. But when I was in junior high, I wanted to join the dance group that all my non-Jewish friends went to, and my parents wouldn't even allow that. They said, oh, you can dance, you already know how to dance. And they were just fearful of the social situation, that this is the way I would be going. And I had to date Jewish boys no matter what. And the no matter what was that I was tall for my age and they were short for theirs. So no matter what, there I was. But I did find one Jewish guy, one very handsome, but he sure could dance. That was my boyfriend in high school.
That's great. And did you encounter any anti-Semitism in Wichita? Oh, sure.
Oh my God, yes. You know, Kansas really was a hotbed for anti-Semitism. And I mean, I can still remember, and the name eludes me now, he was very well known, Father Cochran?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, there was if he wasn't in Wichita, then there was someone similar to him. I can still remember the big cross in the church and the this and that on the main street. And I had experiences that were not pleasant, because it must have been very hurtful to me, because I can still remember when I was 6 years old that my very best friend, who was non-Jewish, said to me, you know, Doris, I like you anyway, even if you did kill Christ. So I said, I was crying to my mother about what was said to me, and this is what we dealt with. And I mean, we had Christian neighbors, and they couldn't understand why don't Jews accept Christ? I mean, that was a big deal. And my mother said, we don't have a middleman, we just go right to the top. So that was my mother. Anyway.
Were there exclusive resorts that you visited, or?
There were, in those years, you have to remember, as old as I am, I was a little child during the 30s, and that was a hotbed everywhere in this country for anti-Semitism. And I remember we used to summer to get away from the heat. There was no air conditioning. We would summer here in Colorado, but we would not be allowed to go to the Broadmoor Hotel. They did not allow Jews. And the Jewish people went to Manitou Springs. That was where we all congregated at the Cliff House Hotel, because they were welcoming. But we encountered a lot of anti-Semitism in those years.
And were there signs? How did Jews know that they weren't welcome at different hotels, for instance?
Well, I didn't personally experience this, but I was told that there were resorts that in Colorado that had signs outside that said no dogs or Jews allowed. Is that pretty plain?
That's pretty plain. And let's kind of jump ahead to how you chose Goucher College.
Well, my best friend that I grew up with happened to also be my cousin, and we were very close and still are. We're exactly the same age. She lives in Boston, I live here, and we still communicate. We love each other dearly. And her mother was from the East and was from New York and had married her father, who was from Tulsa. So that's how they met, because her mother's sister lived in Tulsa. That's how people got together. But the point of my story is, my cousin Ruth belonged to a family where the women in the family all went to Barnard in New York. And that's where she was going to go. And I really didn't know where to go. My sister had graduated from the University of Illinois. She had gone for 2 years to the University of Texas. And I didn't know if I wanted to go to that largest school, although I was very fun-loving. I might have loved that environment as well. But my cousin Ruth was going to Barnard, and my sister, who I explained before was 8 years older, said, you know, we have distant cousins in Tulsa, and 3 sisters, and she had, when we were living in Tulsa, she was 10 years old when we moved to Wichita. She was friendly with one of them very much. And she said, I remember Mickey and her sisters went to Goucher College in Baltimore. They loved it. And by that time, my sister was married to a physician that she met during the war. And he was taking his residency at that time in D.C. And she said, why don't you apply to Goucher? It's in Baltimore. That's very close to Washington, D.C. And see if you can get in. It's a very fine school. And so that's how I applied to Goucher. And at that time, Goucher wanted to interview all the women that they were going to accept. And that was quite a distance, and they didn't even expect me to come, but they were all excited they were getting geographical distribution. So there was a woman who was married to a professor at Wichita State University, and she was contacted by Goucher to interview me. And she was so excited that she was going to interview someone that was thinking about going to Goucher. Here she was in this godforsaken Wichita. Anyway, so she really, really, really promoted my admittance. I tell you, I was over my head at that school. But luckily, I had gone to Wichita High School East. You know, what did I know about an Eastern women's college? And all these women are coming in from prep schools. And my roommate happened to be a product, at Goucher, happened to be a product of the prep school and the business. She was so smart anyway. So when I was doomed, I was sure I was going to flunk out, and she said, you don't study the way you should. And she gave me a crash course in how you write an essay, because I had never written one. She said, you're looking at too many details. You got to get the whole picture, socially, economically, religiously, the picture of the century. Then you got it. Well, you know, she was a great teacher. And I stayed there. I graduated in 4 years, so she set me on the right track.
And tell me just a little bit more about that course in the Old Testament. That was a required course?
That was required, and our professor was, I believe, like Presbyterian, but she was just simply wonderful. And in addition to studying the Old Testament, because I was a art history major, that was what that was what I chose for my major. It was required that I had to also take a course in the New Testament, because how would one even begin to understand Renaissance art without understanding all of the the images that were before you and what was the symbolism. I mean, there was no way to possibly understand it in the way I should without that course. So at that time, I really got a lot of reinforcement about Jesus Christ. And that was, you know, how when he was crucified, how that was not the Jewish way of punishment at all. He was crucified by the Romans, and that he was a political figure that was feared by the Romans, and that's why they crucified him. So, you know, I began to get a lot of knowledge to back up all the things that had happened along the way in my life. And I became very, very interested in religion, everybody's religion. In fact, I think that I was tempted to major in philosophy and religion, but I loved the art and so forth. That's the way I decided to finally go.
And did you encounter anti-Semitism at Goucher?
Oh, never. It was just a joy. It was like everything my mother promised me. She said, if you'll make good grades, we'll send you anywhere. We'll send you anywhere. Just you need to leave Wichita and meet other Jewish people. I mean, I was in such a small environment. And Baltimore was a perfect place because it has an enormous Jewish population. And Goucher was very, very popular with the Jewish people, as well as with the guys that were, you know, that would go off to school and then they would come back and they would date. They were looking for wives. You know, there was plenty you had plenty of dates there. But what they did have that was very nice is when I first went to Goucher, they since have they discarded all of this stuff, but there were non-Jewish sororities. And it was in their constitution or whatever that they could only have so many sororities on campus. And there were no Jewish sororities, just non-Jewish. And the Jewish community of Baltimore loved Goucher. They were proud that they had a school of that quality, along with Johns Hopkins and so forth. And so they had college parents. And so we all had college parents. Everybody was assigned to a college parent, and they were so lovely. We could spend a week. If we had a date and didn't want to get in at 12 o'clock, we could stay at their house, or they invite us for Jewish holidays. It was a very, very nice experience. Jewishly, it was wonderful.
So there were quite a few Jewish students at Goucher?
Tons. I thought, I couldn't believe it. I mean, all my friends were Jewish. Not that Jewish people always have been attracted to Jewish people because of all the experiences we all had accumulated along the way growing up. And so all my friends happened to be Jewish, and they were wonderful friends. And dear, dear friends.
How did you wind up coming to Denver?
Well, the way I came to Denver is really quite a long story, but I was dating several guys very seriously at Goucher. One I became engaged to. And for whatever reasons, it was the outbreak then. It was after World War II. The Korean War had just broken out. And the timing just was off. He was going to have to go back into the service, this guy, and his father was moving his business. There was all kinds of issues. And it was just the wrong time. We broke up. And I went back to Wichita. And along the way, my grandma said to my mother, my grandma worried I was going to be an old maid. For sure, I was never going to get married, and I didn't like any of the guys in Wichita. But I was just biding my time. Wasn't really thinking about it, but my grandma was. So she said to my mother, "You ought to take her someplace. Take her someplace so she'll meet some Jewish people. She really needs to meet people. So my brother had moved to Denver. Our brother was between my sister and me, and he was a horticulturist. He had bought a city floral, as a matter of fact, it's very famous here. Anyway, he was the owner of it for many years. He has passed away a number of years ago already. But my mother and I came out to visit my brother, and on the way she said, well, why don't we go up to a resort? Maybe you'll meet some people in the resort. So we went to Glenwood Springs to the Colorado Hotel. And a lot of people from Denver would go up there in the summer. It was very popular. And I met a lot of people, and I met a lot of young people. By this time I graduated from college, so I was no longer a kid. And I didn't meet anybody in my age group, but that was of any particular romantic interest. But I did meet a couple that were just darling, a married couple like in their 30s that I used to visit with. I'd see them around the hotel. And they lived in Denver, and I just liked talking to them. They liked talking to me. And when my mother and I went back to Denver to visit my brother for a little bit, the first night we were here in Denver, we happened to go out to dinner at a very popular restaurant. And in the restaurant was this darling couple that I had met in Glenwood Springs. And I explained that I was here visiting for a week or so with my mother. And they said, oh, that's great. And there's so many guys here that aren't married. I wonder, and anyway, he got up from the table, I understand later from my now husband, got up from the table in the restaurant, went and called my husband-to-be, and he said, I met this terrific girl, Eddie. If you don't have a great time, I'll pay for the date. And take her out nice. Take her to a good restaurant. He's promoting me. Well, anyway, that's how I met Eddie. And in 10 days, we were engaged. In the meantime, it was like my mother and I were staying at there was a hotel in Wash Park. I forget the name. It was called the Top of the Park, was where you went dancing. And Park something hotel. It's torn down a long time ago. My mother and I were staying there. Some way there, it was like somebody sends up like a smoke that there's a girl in town. She's never been married before. She is Jewish. Anyway, my phone began to ring with all these strange guys calling me, saying they'd like to take me out. They had heard about me. So I'm saying, listen, I came to meet people, so okay, I'm going out with it. Every night I have a date. But I met Eddie. I gone out a few of them before I went out with Eddie. He was my Saturday night date. And so he asked me out for Sunday night, and I said, well, I can't go because I have a date, I'm sorry. Well, then Monday night, well, I can't go, I've got a date, I'm sorry. Well, what about Tuesday night? Well, anyway, he said, who are you going out with? I said, well, I don't know. I'm going out with this one, this one, this one. He said, they're all my fraternity brothers. I will go to the phone, and I'm canceling all these dates because he said, I want to take you out every night. And we were engaged in 10 days. So this is how I met Eddie.
Wow. So what year did you move to Denver then?
1952. That was 71 years, I think, ago.
So from the time when did you graduate from Goucher again?
51.
51. Oh, okay. So that was
I was only going to be a spinster 1 year.
Okay.
My grandma only worried 1 year. I didn't make her crazy.
There you go. And then at what point did you get involved with NCJW?
Well, you know, that took a while. Denver's a very hard community to kind of get acclimated to. At least it was for me. I married a guy that grew up here, went to Colorado University, belonged to a fraternity, And there was everybody that I met was sort of similar. I mean, those were his friends. And no one had, you know, girls got married very, very young in Denver. They were 17 and 18 years old. And I wanted to fit in, but I didn't quite fit because I had had all these other wonderful experiences. And that they were already married with, first of all, for some reason, I thought I must be the youngest because they all had kids when I married them. They all had been married 5 years. Eddie was considered, his mother thought he was a bum because he wasn't married yet. He was 26. So all his friends got married right out of college. And so they already had children. Everybody I met was with children. And they had all gotten married at 18. There were a handful that didn't, I have to say that, and I certainly met them and they were lovely, but there were just less than a handful. So I felt like I was sort of auditioning here to make friends. It was not an easy matter to find a niche. And then I tried playing cards. That wasn't my thing. I became a docent at the art museum. That was pleasant. And then I volunteered for the Jewish Family Service. That sort of appealed to me. And they asked me, my pediatrician was promoting me. He knew that I was having a hard time finding a niche here. And he was very good friends with the executive director of the Jewish Family Service. And he said, you know, Doris Lackner she is a girl with an education that really would fit into something a little more stimulating than what they have her doing. He said, why don't they find something really exciting or stimulating and make her do it, give her the opportunity to chair it. So they asked me to do a family life education program. And I did, there were like 3 or 4 things that I did. One was, there was a lot of interdating and intermarriage just beginning here. So we had a big program on that. And then there was a lot of conversation and gossip about couples in the 40s that were running around, you know, with others. So I did a program on the needs and misdeeds of the wandering 40s, and they had to set up chairs. 400 people showed up. It was such a big success, and I had invited my brother-in-law from Wichita who did marriage counseling. He was a gynecologist, but he also did that. And I invited the president of NCJW to I invited NCJW and Federation to co-chair all this with me so that we would gather more of a crowd. Anyway, NCJW was represented by their president. I think she also spoke at one of our meetings. This was such a success that when the nominating committee met for council, I got a phone call. Would I like to be a vice president? You know, they always start you at the top. Would I like to be a vice president of well, she didn't say what part, but would I like to be a vice president of NCJW? And I said, well, I you know, I don't really know very much about NCJW. She said, you would just love it. And I knew this woman, and I admired her greatly. I forget how we first met. And she said, and you know, she said, there's going to be a national convention in Atlanta, and they will send you. At that time, we had so much money, they sent all the officers to anything that they were doing. They just paid for everything. And they'll send you to Atlanta. And so she said, and then everybody, you'll meet wonderful, intelligent people, and it's such a fabulous organization, and this and this. She was a good salesperson. So away I joined, and became a vice president, was sent to Atlanta. And so I am just mesmerized. Hubert Humphrey was he was a keynote speaker, had just come back from Germany, and the national president, when she opened her mouth, it was like you wanted a copy of her speech. I kept her speech. That's how impressed I was. And it was like, oh my God, I'm getting my brain out of mothballs again. It was such an exciting experience. They just bowled me over. And that's how I became a member.
So what did you get involved with initially in Denver in terms of NCJW?
Well, they made me a vice president of public affairs. So, I have to tell you, why wouldn't I love NCJW? Because I was only, in those years, the national presidents used to visit the sections. So the national president, Josephine Weiner, came to Denver to visit, and they were then, every year they had something fabulous. So the next year they were having a Washington Institute, and I was the vice president of public affairs. And the president said to me, Doris, are you going to, I hope you're going. I said, I don't think so. I said, I just really have joined in this last year, and I don't really know anybody, and no one is going. I would be the only one. And she said, you know me. And that was very impressive. And I went. Now I'll tell you how exciting it was. It was the years of President Lyndon Johnson, and we were very well thought of because we were working so hard in NCJW for civil rights, and they were in the cutting edge of this, in the forefront of it. And Bess, wait a minute, her name's going to go out of my head, unfortunately. There was Arthur
Meyerson?
Arthur Goldberg. Arthur Goldberg, I think that was his name, was our representative of the United Nations. And his wife, Bess Goldberg, was a life member of NCJW, and she was buddies with Lady Bird. And she told Lady Bird that the NCJW was in Washington at an institute on public affairs, and they should invite us to the White House, and they did. So I met Lady Bird, and it was all set up for just us, the public affairs. That's all they invited in those years to the Washington Institutes was. In those years, public affairs was only.
I'm just going to interject for a moment because I know who Lady Bird Johnson was, but you're talking about the First Lady, Lyndon Johnson's wife. Yes.
Absolutely.
And what was she like?
Delightful. You know, she was totally warm, very welcoming, very well, I met her in a receiving line. You know, I didn't, other than how do you do? You know, it was a real formal receiving line. Thank God at Goucher they taught you how to go through a receiving line. Honest to God.
They did? Really?
It was still, you know, as much it was a very intellectual college, they still did little ladylike things. They taught us how to go through a receiving line. So I went through the receiving line with Beth, introducing to Lady Bird. So how do you do? They had when we arrived, they had the Marine Band was playing Hava Nagila. They're serving lox and bagels in the East Room. It was just to never be forgotten. And I have an engraved invitation to this event that says that Mrs. Johnson, I'll show it to you, invites Mrs. Lackner to whatever they called it, maybe a tea or something. But it was the most, I mean, couldn't you just, it was just that thrilling to me. It was thrilling to all of us to be I mean, after my background in all of the anti-Semitism that I felt, to be so welcomed by a First Lady of the United States made me feel like I had hit the jackpot when I joined NCJW, because it was so regarded.
And what were the sorts of topics that were discussed at that Washington Institute then? Was it mostly civil rights at that time?
It was just about when Baltimore was being burned down. It was when there were riots of, it all had to do with racial issues, a lot of that. It was terrible. And we had wonderful speakers that I can remember that, people were saying, oh, the old times were the best times. And we had a speaker that said, it's because the old times were so bad that we're having these times, in regard to racial incidents and what was going on. And, it's hard, that's a lot of years ago.
No, I know, but that was one of the big...
I do have clippings. I think that I have given them to you, but when I came back, and I think I gave all of my stuff to the Rocky Mountain Institute of all of the clippings I had to do a write-up of my experience when I got back, and it went to the Jewish News, and so, it's all in there. So,
right.
So, it went down.
So you started out with NCJW working on issues like civil rights, and then you and I have spoken previously, and you said that you got very involved with children's welfare issues, right?
Well, that was always a priority. Children, women and children, that's still the priorities. But we always went in the areas in which the need was greatest, in those particular areas. And of course, in the 70s, you don't stay in one position in NCJW long. They immediately make you a president if you can put two words together. So I became a president 2 years after I was a vice president. And it's all over before you start. So after that was in 1969 I was president, 69 to 71. And then in the 70s was the women's movement, when women were going back into the workforce. And, those times were difficult for everybody because, first of all, that's when child care, where was it? Where were they going to find child care? So that was one of the issues. And, I've talked before about daycare and all the problems of that. And it was just, it's hard to, and of course, what were we always concerned about was abortion. There were so many things we were working for to make life better for women. And the abortion issue was huge in NCJW, and the Hyde Amendment, which we're still fighting. We've never gotten rid of that. And that was, you remember what that is. That was when there couldn't be any federal funds for low income for abortion. We've never gotten rid of that. So that was the issue then, and it's still an issue.
Can you talk a little bit about windows on daycare?
I did a little bit in that interview I had before, but I was president then, and Bernice Frieder, of blessed memory, because she was my mentor in council, I should say her name absolutely for posterity. I literally learned the organization at her knee. She was a stickler, but she really indoctrinated me with all the abstraction. It's such an abstract. All of our issues are abstraction. And that's, as our national president then, of blessed memory, Joe Weiner, the one that said, "You know me," She said the day should only come that she could explain the National Council of Jewish Women by standing on one foot. It is so complex, and it's not any less now, I don't think. But Windows on Daycare, they were preparing this document in Congress, and we supplied, we meaning all over the country, we were doing research then about all the great needs. So it would go into this document so that they would then enact legislation that would make things that we could see were needed possible. And so I remember through Bernice Frieder's guidance, she knew all the women in all the groups that did public affairs, all the groups in Denver that were working on what we were working on. So she had them all invited. She told me who to invite all over the city to my house to form a coalition for daycare. And that is how that whole, the magic bus that we talked about, it grew out of that coalition because League of Women Voters and Junior League and University Women, National Council of University, something like that.
AAUW.
Yeah, AAUW. That's how they all got involved. With us was all evolved when they were doing the Windows on Daycare. So groups all over the country were doing what I was doing, gathering the coalitions together as a unit to do brainstorming. What shall we do and how shall we do it?
So what was needed to enable women with children to go to work, essentially?
Exactly. That was exactly the cause and what we were working on to make it to be helpful.
So you were working with black women and women of different...
Oh yeah, we worked very closely with all those women. The National Council of Negro Women, I think they called it National NCNW, yeah. A National Council of Negro Women, Church Women United was the Christian group, Jewish, yeah. And then I think I've mentioned all of these, but we all worked together to make all of this happen. And then there was a group called, that this group formed called Women in Community Service. That was still another group that was evolving. It was all things to just make the community better. And one of our presidents, subsequently to my time in office, or maybe 5 or 10 years later, it was called WICS that evolved. All of these things that we were working in with other people kept evolving. So it was a very, very satisfying time to be in an organization like NCJW.
And tell us a little bit about the Magic School Bus.
Well, the Magic School Bus, I think I've told you, and I think it's in I've given all the documents about it because we had a huge spread in the Denver Post in color yet of our magic bus that we got an artist that decorated the bus with animals and zoo and this and that and the other thing. It was just darling. It was just precious. Everybody could see it going down the street. And women volunteered to drive the bus and go to the daycare centers we had toys and books, and they would check out, a child could come on and pick out a book or a toy like a library card, and they could have that for a week, and then the next week we would go back and they could return it, just like going to the library and get something else. So that, and that became, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So that was very exciting to have brought this together, because this was done, as I said, with the League of Women Voters and with Junior League and NCJW and I think the University Women. I think we all were involved. There were four groups. And they all had volunteers that did this. And it was exciting. But it couldn't sustain itself with volunteers because it was hard. They had to drive the bus, and they had to go hither and yon, and then clean the bus, and return the bus, and clean the bus, and do all this stuff, and they got sick of it. So it was hard. So we finally ended up donating it to the library, the Denver Public Library, and they drove it around, did the same thing. And it was like a bookmobile, and terrific. It was terrific. So it ended up in good hands, doing a good deed. So I was tickled with that.
And was CASA a program also that that NCJW was active in during your tenure? CASA, is it C-A-S-A?
Oh, CASA. I know about CASA from the national organization. I think by that time I might have, wait a minute, I do, court-appointed special advocates. Right. Yes, indeed. We definitely were involved. They were the ones that were when a child that was falling through the cracks and was a child usually that didn't have a stable family at all and needed to be represented through the courts to get some kind of care that was appropriate. The CASA, the court-appointed special advocate, of which there were volunteers, and council started this. They did a terrific job. Again, it was taken over, and I know people that did it. I can still remember one of them was very wealthy, and she couldn't stand that this child didn't have nice things. She used to buy clothes for the child that she was representing. She was so touched by it, and women were so caring. It was a beautiful program. And then I think another group took it over, and I don't recall it specifically, but I remember someone else in the community standing up and saying, CASA, and I thought, didn't we start that? And yet someone else did take it over. And you know, this again is what happens to NCJW. We initiate programs, they're just wonderful, but we don't always have the finances or even the human resources to make it get bigger, and other groups take it over, and that's okay. But it's very hard to do PR on something that doesn't sustain itself. You know, Hadassah can always point to their hospital. You know, that's easy. It's very hard to talk about, back to our president that wanted to talk about council on one foot. You just can't. It is so multifaceted, which is what has been stimulating to me all these years.
Tell us about your involvement at the national level. You started going to national conventions and you met lots of women who were interested in the same things you were. You know,
it was probably the most exciting time of my life. I think back to when I was, you know, the most involved in my life, doing things that I love to do. And it was when I was in the 50s. It was that decade. I was on the national board. Well, I was on for 13 years, so I probably came in, well, I know exactly. I came in at 50 and went out at 63. But I just loved it.
You mean this was when you were 50 years old, not 1950, right?
No, it was when I was 50.
Right, okay,
so
I'm sorry, just to clarify.
So when I was 50, it would be 1980. So it would be in the 80s. So we've now done the 60s, the 70s, now we're in the 80s, right? How long are you going to stay?
We're nearing the end. That's why we're getting to the national level. You didn't go beyond into outer space, did you, or global issues?
Okay, so the national organization, first of all, I love the convention. I went to every single convention. I went to every Washington Institute. I just loved it. I thrived on it. And they gave me all kinds, I loved the National Board because they gave me things to do that were stimulating. You know, I would do workshops and you know, with the boards, and how you do you know, how do you lobby, and how do you do public relations, and how do you do this. I mean, I had several opportunities to do these things hands-on, so I was able to share with others. And I loved the meetings. The women were so extraordinary. I felt I never went to an NCJW National Board meeting I didn't learn new words. I mean, it increased my vocabulary. I learned Latin. They're all attorneys, you know. I knew all these things. I mean, it was just, I had this vocabulary. I forgot a lot of it, but it was a very thrilling time because I was with women who were so special, and I could really look up to them and appreciate. Oh, and I went on a NCJW summit with the National Board. One of my favorite presidents was in office then, and she was Lenore Feldman. She passed away way too young. But we were in Israel together in 1988, and they called it a summit, but we got to see all the things. We haven't even talked about Israel, all the programming that we were doing in Israel, and hippie that had come out of Israel that we were then bringing into this country. Have we talked about hippie at all?
No.
Elsewhere? Do you know what it is?
I don't even know what it is.
Oh, it was one of our big programs in Israel. It started there because we supported Hebrew University educational programming, and we supported anything creative that came out of Hebrew University that had to do with childhood education. And they developed a program where they taught illiterate mothers, because we were getting immigrants from like Africa. There were a lot of women that were totally illiterate that were becoming a part of the Israel fabric, and they couldn't read. So we were teaching mothers how to read so they could read to their preschool children and prepare them to go to school and compete with the Ashkenazi Jews. These were the Sephardic Jews that, you know, there's the Sephardic Jews that are very educated, and then there's the Sephardic Jews from more of the African.
We're talking about Morocco and
yes,
Algeria.
Yes, and the women where they were kept, or like the Ethiopian Jews, or you know that. And that was called HIPPY, Home Instruction Program for Preschool Youngsters. I don't know, I used to get their information all the time. It came to this country. One of our women, one of our national board members, who then became a national president, Nan Rich, from Florida. Wait a minute, I'm trying to think how it came. Hillary Clinton brought it. She saw it in Israel, and she wanted to bring it to Arkansas. It was when Bill Clinton was president. And she, some which way, knew Nan Rich, who was a president, or a president gonna be, or was, or very involved in NCJW. She knew her, and Nan, together with Nan, was a catalyst to help it come into Arkansas. And we had hippie going around, we had it here in Colorado. You know, but again, we're back to, we have had such brilliant ideas that don't sustain because there's something missing, and I don't know what it is, that we start things and then, well, others take them over. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Israel took it over. They kept that program. We did Manaf. Manaf in Israel was throwaway kids. And we would take and retrain them and love them and put them in dormitories and give them the comfort care and loving that and education so they could go to college. I mean, I don't remember all the things. Israel took that over. So we did a lot of things in Israel. I don't hear so much anymore because I'm not involved. And again, I think it's a lack of resources. We used to have a magazine that came to your door that all the members got. We gave up so many things because we couldn't afford it. We used to have newsletters that we printed and it went all over the city, and then postage became so expensive.
And how many members at its peak in Denver, how many members did NCJW have? Do you have an idea?
I think when I was president, it was 1,000. Before that, I think it was more. I think there was a time, I think I heard at one time we were over could have 2,000 maybe. We were the only organization here. We started in 1893, and we knocked on there were presidents. Sarah Lee Pollock, an old timer, she knocked on every door on the west side of Denver and said, "We are more alike than we are different. Please join our organization."
So this was the divide between the German Jews who were established and well-to-do at this point, and the Eastern European
and she went
immigrants
on the west side and knocked on every door.
Mm-hmm.
I think they were several thousand. I don't really know. It could be in our archives somewhere, but I don't think I've ever seen it.
Now tell me how you wound up being the vice president at the national level of the NCJW.
Oh, yeah, that was a very, very high honor for me. I just was so thrilled, and it was an aspiration. Well, first of all, I went up through the ranks. First, I was president of Denver. It was Denver section then. Then I was state public affairs chair in Colorado. Then I wanted desperately to get on the national board, and there were several people in Denver that were already on, and we're back to geographical again. There were 2 or 3 women. And how in the hell was I going to get on? They were in my way. So I had to go up, I had to become, the only way to get on, with so many others already there, was to become the Western District president. We had 5 districts then: Western, Central, Northeast and Central and Southern and blah, blah. So I went on as I got to be Western District President, so I had that role. That put me on the national board. That automatically put me on for 3 years. So then it was time to run for the board if I wanted to stay on, which I did. And I had done a good job of whatever it was that we were doing. So I was elected all by myself I did it all by myself to the national board. So now I'm on 6 years. Then either you have to get off or you have to run for office. So I ran for recording secretary, and I won that, and there was an assistant recording secretary. Now I happen to love that, and I'll tell you why. We had been invited by the Library of Congress they wanted our documents. They offered to be the repository of our documents. Why? Because we had contributed so much to our country in terms of the meeting of the immigrants and we did such a big program here in the day of resettling Russian Jews. I mean, we did so much resettlement in Denver and all over the country. We did all that. It's impossible to report all the things that I saw happening. And I loved it because I felt if I'm writing the minutes of this organization, It's history. I mean, I saw the historical element of it, and so instead of this is an icky job, I loved it. First of all, when you work with staff, it's a whole other life. So I'm writing minutes and I don't type, and the assistant secretary does type, so she's typing. I'm doing everything in longhand. And I am sitting next to a professional parliamentarian. And I learned so much that way. I mean, that was a legal process that was so interesting to me, that so little was practiced. I tried to teach it to Jackie, and I think I failed. I mean, I had things printed. I sat in on her meetings to help her. I mean, she thought she could make the motion.
Give us an example of how that would work.
Excuse me?
Give us an example of how this parliamentary process works.
I'm not sure I understand the part you want me to explain.
In order for a motion to be considered, for instance, there's a very formalized procedure for it,
of course,
right?
There is, and the president cannot make the motion. She can entertain a motion. I will entertain a motion. Therefore, Joe Blow holds up their hand if she's already indoctrinated them. And in writing, if you do it legally, and you stand up like they did at National Board and made a motion, and it was all in writing, and then someone formally seconded it, and then you give your what did they call it? Your explanation. That's not the word.
A rationale?
Thank you. You give your rationale, and then they explain it, and then they vote on it. That's the way it works. And it's voted up, it's voted down. Then it's all the things you can table this and do that, and you have to have a blueprint to know how to do it. But most organizations use Robert's rules. And I was trying to just give the barest basics to Jackie. And I don't know, I think I failed. But anyway, I tried. But sitting next to a professional parliamentarian was such an exciting experience. And we had one, of course, at all our national conventions. I mean, it was 100%. It was 100% perfect. Because at a national convention, have you been?
No.
Oh, well, they're marvelous, because a national convention is when you make all your resolutions, and they're debated, and it's so interesting to hear the debates, and they're voted on, and the professional parliamentarian is making sure that it's all going, like you're conducting the meeting, and she is giving you help as far as what process you could then enact, because it gets complicated.
So let's return to you're now the recording secretary.
Oh, okay, that's right.
And you're still heading up to vice president.
So I'm only going to be recording secretary 3 years, and now if you want to stay, you have to either you retire or you run for office, and so I ran for vice president. And they elected, I'm trying to think how many they elect. I think it's 3. I'm not positive. It's at least 3. It might have been more than 3, but they elect, let's say it's 3. 3 are pretty sure. And so then you're voted on, and then you either win or you lost.
Did you have to do campaigning?
Well, being a little reticent, I wasn't doing anything. So my daughter Nancy is Nancy, and she is, I told you, she's a ball of fire. So she said, so you don't want to be elected? I said, what are you saying? She said, well, why aren't you campaigning, Mother? Get on the phone, tell people you'd like their support. I said, I can't do that. She said, okay, well then you don't want it. And so I made a few phone calls, and it was. I have to tell you the one thing that touched my heart. So all the sections across the country, they get together, and who knows who and what about them, and so on and so on. And I understand that my original national president, Joe Weiner, the first president I ever met, was already an old lady then and didn't go to any meetings anymore. And I understand she got out of bed and came to their nominating committee to say, elect Doris Lackner.
Wow.
I thought that was so. They told me, the girls that did that said, Joe Weiner came to tell us. I didn't know them, but she said, be sure that you elect, and I was very flattered by that, and I don't know what I did to you know how you just like somebody because for whatever reason. So I always say Joe Weiner, you know how Colburn got Joe Biden out of the blue? Listen, Joe Biden, well, she must have said whatever. So anyway, that's how I got on.
So when you look back over everything that you did with NCJW, of what are you most proud, would you say, of your accomplishments and your involvement?
I'm proud that I got that far because I was with women that I looked up to and had high regard for, and the fact that they felt that I was a peer was my greatest honor.
And when I talked to you one other time, you told me that you considered NCJW to have been your career. Is that an accurate assessment?
Don't you think so? It was mine. I mean, I had no other career. I made a career out of it because I was getting so much out of what I was giving. I felt I got so much more than I gave because it helped me grow as an individual and see life in a so much broader perspective than I could ever have done any other way, and gave me opportunity. They gave me so many opportunities to grow and to see the world, so to speak. How else would I be shaking hands with Lady Bird? I mean, it was thrilling to me. I found NCJW very thrilling organization, and I felt like I was lucky that I experienced it in the times that I did when it could be what it was. I don't know that any organization in this, I don't know all the obstacles that they must deal with, but it has to be very difficult today.
But you felt fully accepted as a Jewish woman living in America, functioning at a very high level at that time.
I did indeed. I did, and I never gave it. After I got out of Wichita and those years that were so such negativism, after I got out of that and was able to go to, I mean, the greatest thrill of my life was going to Goucher because it gave me opportunity to grow and to really find out how to think. I mean, it was a wonderful, I learned how to evaluate what's right, what's true, and what's false. So many people don't know that. That's why we have so much trouble today. They don't know when they're getting wrong information.
Right.
So to me, Goucher was just, oh my God, I'd still give him a lot of money. I do, because I'm so grateful they taught me how to think. And I'm grateful to NCJW, and I give them a lot of money still because they gave me opportunity. I want to give back what I can now because I can't give myself, but I can give them money. So I just feel I've really been very, very fortunate, and I've had really wonderful experiences, and I think that it has made me an upbeat person because I can see the picture, the whole picture.
Well, perfect, Doris, and I think that NCJW has a lot to thank you for also, and I thank you for a really wonderful interview. It was my pleasure to
Well,
listen.
I hope I haven't worn you out. It's 10 after 1.
I know. I think we've worn you out, so we're going to let you go.
How long have you been? I mean, how long has this been? I've been talking forever, and I said I was going to be hoarse, but you could notice I don't shut up.